both Miriam and I had powers of attorney, but I chose not to exercise those powers. That is to check my mother's financial affairs because she had asked me specifically not to. So after Mum died, I spoke with her solicitor and he got hold of the bank statements for me for the previous 5 years. I had expected perhaps to see, I don't know, $10,000, $20,000 gone missing. It was over $350,000 just in the 5 years.
What advice or encouragement would you like to share with others based on what you've been through?
If you find yourself in a similar situation, you should be aware that...
Welcome to Don't Be Caught Dead, a podcast encouraging open conversations about dying and the death of a loved one. I'm your host, Catherine Ashton, founder of Critical Info, and I'm helping to bring your stories of death back to life. Because while you may not be ready to die, at least you can be prepared. Don't Be Caught Dead acknowledges the lands of the Kulin Nations and recognises their connection to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander and First Nation peoples around the globe. Grace is a freelance creative professional who lives in rural Victoria. While her parents were still alive, they lived in a regional city in New South Wales. Her sister Miriam lives in the same city. After Grace's father, Henry, died at 86 in 2010, her mother Patricia's physical and mental health gradually deteriorated. In 2015, she had a fall at home. Hospitalisation followed, then admission to a nursing home. After Patricia died at the end of 2020, Grace discovered that Miriam had spent, withdrawn and transferred to herself and her son hundreds of thousands of dollars from Patricia's bank account during her time while she was in the nursing home. Grace had long suspected some degree of misappropriation, but this was way beyond her imagining. Believing it would be straightforward to bring Miriam to justice, Grace hired a solicitor based in Patricia's home city, one recommended by a solicitor friend in common, and commenced legal proceedings. The outcome was devastating, and the proceedings far more protracted and expensive than Grace's original solicitor had led her to expect. She eventually hired another. It's obvious to her now that had she let the theft rest, she'd be at least $60,000 better off. It's also obvious to her that the frameworks, legalities and practices around estate law and the powers of attorney are not all what people commonly assume them to be. Neither fairness nor justice are givens. Hers is a cautionary tale of great import for anyone who suspects a relative of elder financial abuse or the intent to commit it. This is her story. Thank you for joining us, Grace.
Thank you for having me, Catherine.
Now, Grace, can you please briefly summarise the events that occurred after your mother died?
Okay, briefly is a stretch, but I'll do my best. Okay, so both Miriam and I had powers of attorney, but I chose not to exercise those powers, that is to check my mother's financial affairs because she had asked me specifically not to. Miriam had a history of what I and my mother found to be abusive behaviour. Because I lived a long way from my mother and Miriam lived close by, Mum was basically, ruled by her whims and was kind of forced to sublimate herself in many ways. She actually told me she was frightened of Miriam many times and begged me, and when I say begged, I mean that quite literally, begged me not to do anything whatsoever that could make Miriam angry. So foolishly, I didn't, while Mum was in the nursing home, I didn't look into her financial affairs. I just kept right out of everything. I obeyed her wishes, and I know now that I shouldn't have. I basically should have lied to her, looked into her bank accounts, phoned Miriam and said, I can see what you're doing. If you continue with this, I'll get a solicitor involved and I will see you prosecuted to the fullest possible extent. But foolishly, as I say, I did nothing. So after Mum died, I spoke with her solicitor, who was a family friend of many years standing, who was very, very supportive. And he got hold of the bank statements for me for the previous 5 years. And I had expected perhaps to see, I don't know, $10,000, $20,000 gone missing. It was over $350,000 just in the 5 years that Mum was in the nursing home. However, the powers of attorney began in 2011, and I subsequently got more bank records, and it looked to me like there was much misappropriation well before Mum went into a nursing home. So a friend who's a solicitor said, look, I've got a friend who's in that city and a solicitor, and she's great, and I think you should hire her. So I did. That turned out to be a very expensive exercise. Okay, so what the solicitor told me when I explained everything to her, I became my own forensic accountant as a result of this. I put together a spreadsheet that I still regard as a work of art, basically. You know, a cover sheet with everything summarized neatly and color-coded across various categories of expenditure, and a sheet for every year of the misappropriations, and shared this with the solicitor. And the advice I received from that solicitor, or I should say the solicitor in her office, whom she appointed to my case, was, okay, yes, clear case of misappropriation. You've got a great chance of getting a lot of this money back. We reckon it'll cost you, even if it goes to court, we're looking at an absolute maximum of around $50,000, give or take. And, you know, that should all happen within 6 months. Long story short, I found them utterly inept, extremely slow in communicating. And I'd always, whenever I raised this, it would be, you know, the response would be along the lines of, oh, look, you know, so-and-so only works part-time. And so that's why I've not received anything from you for 6 weeks. It just went on and on and on and on. And of course, the invoices kept coming. And one of those invoices, for example, was for $6,000 and was sent in error to me. Had I paid it, I'm sure I'd never have seen that money back. I mean, you know, this was piling. And I don't use this word lightly. It was piling trauma upon trauma. I was in such a discombobulated state. It was so extremely distressing to deal with this, at a point where I'd also lost my job and was feeling very betrayed, you know, by the entire family, basically. I also discovered after Mum died that, you know, promises she'd made to me around money and compensation for money that she and my father had given to Miriam when she first married many decades ago were just hot air. You know, they weren't, you know, compensation because they helped her when she got divorced, told me when I got divorced that they were unable to do the same, that they'd compensate me in their wills. Didn't happen. So I found myself staggered and shockingly depressed at, you know, everything that was going on, and found myself with a dud solicitor on top of that, who became quite adversarial when I indicated that I was unhappy with the service I was getting. Anyway, I had my spreadsheets outlining everything that had happened. I had the solicitor telling me, okay, we've got, you know, around 6 months worth of waiting here. And yep, here's this costing of, you know, a maximum of $50,000. When that, and so much research ensued, mainly on my part. For example, I was also very suspicious because when I visited my mum when she first went into hospital after falling at home, she was obscenely emaciated. And I discovered later through her medical records that she weighed 30 kilos and was diagnosed with extreme malnutrition when she went into hospital. And to be honest, this is quite a shocking allegation, but in my view, in my very firm opinion, Miriam was basically letting my mum starve to death. And my knowledge of my sister's frame of mind leads me to believe that she was doing this deliberately, which was in profound contrast to her assertions throughout the course of this legal stoush that she had been looking after mum, with the greatest care and concern, and feeding her and cooking for her and making sure her house was clean, and all of these claims to, assiduous care, when clearly mum was literally starving to death. Furthermore, I was the one who cleaned her house after she'd moved into the nursing home. She had a small dog at the time, and there was dog feces and evidence of urine throughout the entire house, which I just found utterly disgusting, obviously. There was every indication not only of misappropriation, but also of, I guess you could say, passive, for want of a better word, physical and emotional abuse. And this history goes back years. Miriam was quite violent on occasion towards mum. She was the one who crawled out of the bedroom window in the middle of the night to, go exercise her freedoms. And while that's fine, when she was confronted with the wrath of my parents after doing things like that, I was the one who would cower in the corner and go, oh, yeah, okay, I'm grounded. I've been a bad person. I'll take my punishment. Miriam would get extremely abusive, both verbally, and I've seen her punch mum in the back. Miriam was about 5'10". Mum was barely 5 feet tall. So there was this history of aggression and pretty awful stuff happening within the family. That was another reason why I was suspicious when Miriam and her husband just suddenly, when our parents were getting very elderly and their health was deteriorating, it just seemed a bit too much of a coincidence that Miriam suddenly wanted to move to the same city when she'd spent most of her adult life referring to Dad as a misogynist, racist pig, and Mum to, and Mum in terms I won't repeat on a podcast. So, why would somebody who professes utter loathing of their parents suddenly move to be close to their parents when their parents are approaching death? Rhetorical question. Anyway, there was much research there, leading up to the preparation of an affidavit. The crunch came when my original solicitor prepared an affidavit that looked to me like it was written by, at best, a mediocre first-year law student. It was so badly structured. It was so badly articulated.
And if you can just explain what is an affidavit?
Oh, sorry. It's basically an accusatory document. It's the document that you, as, I guess, a plaintiff, have drafted to say, okay, here's what I accuse you, the defendant, of doing.
So it's a sworn statement.
It's a sworn statement that your solicitor presents to the other side's solicitor, and they, of course, have the opportunity to respond. Once the affidavit is presented to your opponent, they can respond, and then your choices are let things go, like just cut the cord, we're done here because you've decided it's not worth the trouble and expense. Or you also, when you present an affidavit, when your solicitor sends an affidavit to the other party, they usually also include a demand for, in a case like this where we're talking about misappropriated money that represents part of the other person's entitlement to the deceased person's estate. So we were both equal beneficiaries in Mum's will. So in effect, she had stolen, in my view, a huge chunk of my inheritance. So
and just before, so that was what was written in the affidavit at that point?
The affidavit, basically, the spreadsheet I prepared, which detailed every single instance of withdrawal, transfer, or checks, every single bit of money that I found to have been questionably taken from my mother's account was in that spreadsheet. The affidavit relied on the spreadsheet as the evidence, and the bank statements, of course, as evidence of misappropriation. So the affidavit, if you like, summarised the larger transactions or summarised the smaller transactions and went into great detail about the larger transactions. We're talking about, $20,000 transferred to Miriam's account for no apparent reason. We're talking about over $100,000 spent on renovations, this sort of thing. Anyway, the affidavit summarises what you're accusing the other person of, and you could say that the spreadsheet I did was supporting evidence.
And what were you led to believe by your initial solicitor that the outcome would be of presenting that evidence in the affidavit?
My solicitor didn't lead me to expect any particular outcome. Because of course they're, for obvious reasons, they're wary of doing that. They certainly can't guarantee any given outcome. What they do is simply advise you along the way. So, okay, what we can do, you've gathered all this evidence and you're making these accusations. Let's put all of that into an affidavit. Our first step is to send her a copy of that affidavit, accompanied by, we make an offer. Basically, we say, if you are willing to pay this amount, we won't take this to court. So, of course, you're expecting either a kind of stuff you response, or any decent person would say, okay, alrighty then, here, I'll give you this. Here's my counter offer. What'll it take to make this go away? That classic kind of scenario. The next step after that, if you as the accuser feel that you're not satisfied with the response from your opponent, you can either, again, let it drop, or you can lodge the affidavit with the Supreme Court. I didn't know this at the time, and thank goodness that affidavit wasn't lodged with the court, because the affidavit was so badly written, as I mentioned earlier, and because even after I'd corrected it, they even got things like they got my parents' names wrong. Got dates wrong, got fine details wrong. This is not a document I wanted to see presented in court as my key piece of evidence. That wasn't something I wanted to see presented in court only to have Miriam's barrister go at me in the witness box saying, says this here, but I have your spreadsheet in front of me and the spreadsheet says something completely different. If you sign an affidavit without checking every tiny detail in it, you're in big trouble, potentially, if the case does go to court. Further, I should say here, I dropped my solicitor at that point. I was so distraught. I was paying rent all this time. I've never been able to afford to buy my own house as a single woman, and for a long time a single parent. So my inheritance was basically my shot at buying my own home. And I was renting. So every week that this dragged on and on and on, I didn't have a job and I was paying a small fortune in rent. So,
and can I ask, what sort of time frame are we talking now when you actually went from the initial solicitor to engaging your next solicitor? Talking openly about death and grief can sometimes be triggering. If you find you need support, please reach out to our support services and the bereavement organisations listed on our resource hub. All links are in the show notes of this episode.
It was around 1.5 years. That's how long again, foolishly, it's only with the benefit of hindsight that you realise, I think, what you could have done differently to better effect. But when you're caught up in something like this and you're emotionally distraught, you're not thinking clearly, you're trying to, and all of my clear thinking went into preparing my evidence, I guess you could say. But because I just got to breaking point over the affidavit, the same friend who'd recommended my solicitor to me, I think, felt terrible about what had happened and recommended I look for another solicitor through this directory I'd never heard of called Doyle's Directory, which is an industry, a law industry directory that lists top ranking. It ranks solicitors and barristers in every state and territory by merit. So you can go in, anyone can go in there, and you can, and I also didn't realize I needed an accredited specialist in estate law. I had a solicitor who, waxed lyrical about experience, vast experience in estate law, but that's not at all the same thing as an accredited specialist in estate law. How that affects you in several ways. One of them is you're still paying a great deal of money for any half-decent solicitor. But what happens with an accredited specialist is, for example, they won't get a barrister on board, and there you're paying mega bucks for a barrister. They won't get a barrister on board until the very last minute when you're about to go to court because they don't need one. They have the specialist knowledge they need to take you right up to the courthouse door, pretty much, as I understand it. Whereas my original solicitor wanted a barrister on board very soon after we started all of this because she very clearly, again, with the benefit of hindsight, didn't know how to proceed with the case and needed to consult a barrister. That cost me an enormous amount of money. All up, I spent at least, I think, $30,000 on this solicitor who got me nowhere an entire 18 months. Add to that the rent I was paying and, very expensive exercise. So I get this wonderful accredited specialist who does far more in the space of 6 months than the original solicitor did in those 1.5 years, and who, again, it's lucky that I fell out with my solicitor over the affidavit because, as my new solicitor advised, if I'd just become impatient and wanted to get things over with, I would have proceeded to have that affidavit lodged with the Supreme Court. My new solicitor said, thank goodness you didn't do that, because once you lodge an affidavit with the Supreme Court, it's a runaway train. You are going to court. End of story. The reason that's a terrible thing to know is that my solicitor almost snorted when I told her 6 months, 50 grand. She said, okay, I don't know why on earth you were told that. I would say, on the basis of my experience, it will cost you at least $100,000 at least to take this to court. If you lose, and yes, all of this seems very clear. Yes, there's been misappropriation of funds. But if you lost, and your sister, you might lose if your sister, for example, insists that, as she has been insisting throughout this whole thing, that your mother gave her absolutely free range with her bank account. She can't prove that happened. You can't prove it didn't happen. But what say you lose? You could not only lose your 100 grand, but you could be forced to pay a significant portion of Miriam's legal costs. So you're looking here at this amount of $350,000 or so You've got to pay rent. And she said it will take you at least 2 years to get into court. I don't know why they told you 6 months. That's just ludicrous. You might get a court date. You might be allocated a court date within 6 months, but that court date will be at least 2 years from now. So you can imagine, I mean, you know that feeling when your whole body just goes cold from shock? That's what happened. And she said, look, I don't think it's worth your while pursuing, precisely because of those facts. You'll barely break even and you'll pay another $50,000 in rent. So you can see it's a very dismal state of affairs, despite this being what seems to be a fairly clear-cut case of shocking misappropriation. So what happened from there was she said, look, if you want to give it one more shot, we can rewrite the affidavit because, yes, basically it's a mess. We can also draft a summons, which is a very scary document, basically saying we're taking you to court, and it's an adjunct to the affidavit, if you like, that's yet more formal and yet more, I guess, threatening. I mean, when I read the affidavit, the hairs stood up on my arms. It was, basically, you did this, we're taking you to court, and to put it colloquially, you're toast. It, as I say, terrified me to read it. I dare say, and she said, look, that's your last shot, and we can make another offer and say, basically, pay this amount or we're taking you to court. That's it. This is your last chance. And that's what we did. And the response after about, I think, 6 weeks was get stuffed, basically. No, knock yourself out, take me to court, go ahead, which was a huge gamble on Miriam's part. She had no way of, huge, but it paid off for her. So basically I paid, I think, around $60,000 in legal fees. By the time I actually bought a house, I'd expended, from the time of this all starting, I'd expended at least another $50,000 on rent. So there's $120,000 gone. And that's quite apart from the $165,000 I was entitled to that had been stolen by Miriam. And it was a very rude awakening. And I just had to cut my losses, get some very good therapy, and that's not a joke, I really did, and walk away, knowing that Miriam would never be brought to justice, and that's that. So it's a cautionary tale, I think, for, as you said in the introduction, Catherine, for anyone who discovers elder financial abuse on the part of a relative or friend or whomever associated with their deceased loved one, and thinks it will be a cut and dried case to get it to court, win, shame the other person, and have them penalised. I guess you could say it's somewhat akin to a divorce settlement where people make assumptions about what they're entitled to without understanding the intricacies of the legislation in question, only to find that they've miscalculated badly. I mean, I wish I'd known about accredited specialists, for example. If I'd just known that, this whole case, and hired this solicitor from the get-go, the whole case would have been done and dusted in 6 months. Yes, I would have walked away shockingly disappointed, but I would have only spent around $25,000, $30,000 on legal fees. I would have only been paying rent for that 6 months, and however long on top of that it took me to find a house to buy. House prices would have been about 15 to 20% cheaper in the area where I wanted to buy. So, yeah, there's not only the awful set of facts at play, there's dealing with the fallout of that.
And so can you just talk me through We've obviously discussed the legal side of things in relation to the conflict that you had with your sister and you trying to bring her to justice, in your words. Could you sort of, it seems like that concurrently while this was going on, also it sounds like that you were settling what assets that your mother did have. Is that right? So that was happening at the same time, was it?
Okay. Yeah, that's a somewhat complicated scenario that I'll try to simplify. After, the estate was subject to probate, that went through very smoothly, no problem. And the house that Mum was living in before she went into the nursing home, which Miriam and I had agreed to rent out, we sold. We agreed to sell it. That was obvious, I guess. And we were both, it sold relatively quickly, and we each got our half share of the proceeds of that sale. But Miriam and her husband were at the time living in my parents' old family home, which Mum had agreed to let them live in rent-free under some duress. I think she was coerced into it. That's my view. Well, she basically told me that was the case. So they'd lived rent-free there for 7 years by the time Mum died. And Miriam had said, "Oh, you'll have to buy me out." At the time, I was playing nice. I knew that it could get very combative, so I said, "Okay, you get your valuer, I'll get my valuer, and we'll meet in the middle if there's a discrepancy." That happened. There was a discrepancy, but by the time the valuations were in, Miriam had decided, suddenly did a complete about face and said, "Oh, we want to sell. We want to buy a different, we want to move somewhere else for various reasons." So that was good news. And one of the things we did sell the house. It took quite a while. It was a difficult sell for various reasons that I won't go into, but yeah, it was a hard sell basically in a market that was far from stable. So it was a great thing when we finally got a sale, even if that was for, less than anticipated. And what Miriam did was, when the case was underway, said, "I'm going to refuse to sign the contracts." God, I can't even remember what this was over. But one of the things she did was, this young couple had bought the house. They'd probably sold their own, literally ready to move, ready to sign the contract. And Miriam said, "I'm not signing it unless..." It was blackmail, basically, pure and simple. I can't remember what the condition was now, but yeah, that was the kind of behaviour I was dealing with. So, and one of the conditions I imposed was I put a caveat on the money from that sale so that neither of us could obtain that second part of Mum's estate until the stoush was settled. It was just held in trust for a long, long time.
And was that advice that you'd got from your solicitor at the time?
Yeah. Actually, it was advice from Mum's solicitor. When I was talking to him, he said, "Do this quickly," and I did. And I was very glad I did.
And just so it's clear in my mind, in relation to timing-wise, where were we? Had you written the affidavit by that stage? Was it pre that happening?
I think it was around the same time. The affidavit, I have to say, was a year in coming, at least. This was yet another of the frustrations, and it went back and forth, as I say, many times. And the falling out was because I was dissatisfied with the quality of the work.
And all of this time, I'm assuming you're also grieving.
Sort of, yeah, I have to say. I'm going to get teary now, which is weird because I've cried a lot over the case, but I felt so profoundly betrayed by my mother. And there are all sorts of reasons for that I could talk for hours about, obviously, as most people can, but I felt so profoundly betrayed by Mum. I felt that the self she had presented to me for many years was, in many ways, probably quite disingenuous, and that she might have kind of played me and Miriam off against one another to some extent because she feared Miriam, but also feared my anger about what she was letting Miriam get away with. And I feel for her on that count. You know, you have to extend some degree of compassion. But yes, I was emotionally distraught to a degree I've never been before. And I've been through a couple of divorces, so I know distraught very well indeed. And and of course in Victoria we were in lockdown, even where I was living at the time, we're in lockdown. And I was living like a hermit basically. And so I was alone pretty much 24/7 for, a couple of years or more. And people get tired. That's the other thing you discover. And I think it's fair enough. It's like that friend who goes on and on about their ex. People have a cutoff point for listening to your woes, especially if you're just tending to repeat yourself over and over and over, no matter how compassionate they are and how lovely they are. At a certain point, that's fodder for therapy. It's not wise or helpful to dish it out to your friends constantly or family members.
Yeah, and at what point in time did you realise, okay, look, I think I need to speak to someone?
Very early on, and I got in touch with a therapist I'd engaged previously a few times, and I knew that she was a specialist in a particular type of therapy that focused squarely on trauma. And if anyone's interested in that, I can send you the details, Catherine. But it's extremely effective. And I contacted her and said, look, this is what I'm going through. After it's all over, I'd like to do this trauma therapy again. And she said, Grace, I think you should do it now. Ironically, she'd also been through a stoush with a sibling over a relative's estate, and won handsomely. And, she said, I think you'll benefit greatly from doing it now. It will put you in an entirely different frame of mind. And, go away, think about it. And I did. And I did the therapy again, way before the case was settled. And it was effective up to a point. But as as I knew already from being familiar with this particular mode of therapy, if the trauma is ongoing for any length of time, the effects of the therapy will diminish. And they did. And I was in a very sorry state. And I can't actually say I have even yet grieved my mother's death. It's like I'm quite numb to the whole thing. Again, because I feel so deeply betrayed, no matter how much compassion I can muster for my mother's circumstances, I'm really bloody angry with her, if I can be blunt about it. I'm really still bloody angry with her. And I know all about, the ethos of forgiveness, but I just can't come at it, to be brutally honest. At the moment, perhaps I'll come to that in time. I can let go. I can do all manner of things to make sure I don't think or talk about this at length. And the reason I'm talking today is if I can spare just one person this kind of hell, job well done.
And so you mentioned that Patricia died at the end of 2020, your
Yes.
mother. When you realised that it's not in your interest to take the matter any further, what year was that?
That was only last year. Because it was September 2022 when this new solicitor said to me, okay, it's going to cost you $100,000. It's going to take 2 years. But again, if you want to give it one last shot, we rewrite the affidavit, We accompany that with a draft summons. We send that to her solicitor, and either you get an offer, you get a counter offer, or you walk away because Miriam says, no, not coming to the party. And by the time that happened, by the time that played out, several rounds of corrections to the affidavit, the drafting of the summons, me checking both documents thoroughly, several rounds of corrections and changes. And, the Christmas New Year break, it wasn't until kind of, I guess, early 23 that things finally came to the point where we could send the affidavit and draft summons. And it took weeks for Miriam to respond. That was obviously a deliberate ploy as well. But it is, I guess I'm astounded that someone could not only steal that much money, but also let a parent or anyone get to the point where they weigh 30 kilos and not be called to account for that. It just staggers me. It staggers me that nobody in the hospital system questioned why my mother was in such a shocking physical state when she was first admitted. Why was that not followed up? You do get the sense of, oh, look, she's in her mid-90s, or she's in her 90s, she's going to die soon anyway. Let's just let that slide. It's staggering to me the extent to which we don't matter once we get to a certain age, even to many of the professionals who are charged with looking after us and guarding our well-being. That just staggered me.
And so tell me, obviously, given the fact that it was only really sort of this year that this has come to some sort of conclusion, what has this experience influenced you in preparing for your own death?
That's such a great question. Obviously, I have an ironclad will. I only have one child, my daughter. She's married with kids, and very happily so, and I adore my son-in-law greatly. However, again, having been through two, de facto divorces, I know only too well that even people who seem like the last people on earth to get nasty over money, in the case of a marital split, people are hurting and they lash out, or they can lash out. So I wanted to make sure that were I to die and my daughter be in a situation where she was perhaps, on the brink of splitting from her husband, that no way on earth can anyone other than her get her hands on my estate. So I consulted my financial advisor, who recommended that I get in touch with an estate law solicitor who does nothing but draft wills. He advised me, I already had a will, but it was quite, I guess, it was basic, drafted by a solicitor friend many years ago. And this new solicitor looked at it and said, okay, yeah, we can improve a lot on this. And you might like to think about a testamentary trust, which basically means, I cannot explain this in fully comprehensible terms. Basically, it means that your beneficiary is your sole beneficiary and nobody else can touch any part of your estate if you should die and there be a conflict between your beneficiary and their spouse. So, yeah, I put that in place. And I'm a bit lax with this, but I'm also drafting, I think it's called an emotional will, is it they call it these days, where that's where you can lay out everything you want for your funeral, your burial or cremation or whatever you choose to have done with your remains, what music you want played. And if it's not already in your will, little things like, I want this piece of jewelry to go to so-and-so, and I want this artwork to go to somebody else, if you so choose. So, and advanced care directive as well. I think it's really important to have that in place.
And given your personal experience, you've touched on a few of them, but just recapping, what advice or encouragement
would you like to share with others based on what you've been through?
Okay, first point, which I haven't mentioned already, is that if you find yourself in a similar situation, you should be aware that, one of the assumptions I made erroneously was that, okay, someone has power of attorney that gives them access to somebody else's money. And I just assumed that if you misappropriated money from that person under power of attorney, that you would have to provide receipts for every cent you'd spent and justify that expenditure on the grounds that it was absolutely directly and solely for the benefit of the person whose account you were taking the money from. No such thing applies. That is not true. That was a huge shock. Unless that stipulation is written into the power of attorney document, it doesn't fly, doesn't exist. Miriam could, and did, assert vehemently that every single cent she took from Mum's account was for Mum's benefit. But, this included things like a couple of $1,000 spent on an overseas air ticket and spa treatments, which certainly weren't for Mum because she was completely immobilised in a nursing home bed. There was no onus on Miriam whatsoever within a legal framework to account for the money she'd taken. So that's one cautionary note. And the other I would say is, if you're given powers of attorney and they're joint powers of attorney, make sure you understand exactly the nature of the power that's granted to you before you sign that document. And get legal advice even on what that power of attorney gives you and doesn't give you. And if you feel it needs to be amended in some way, seek that amendment as stridently as you possibly can. Second is, if you suspect someone of misappropriating a dying person's funds, act on it immediately. Get a solicitor involved immediately and make sure you go to the Doyle's directory and you find an accredited specialist with a very high rank. They cost a lot more they cost about, in my experience, about 30% more than any other solicitor, but they know a great deal more. They're much more efficient. They have much better experience, and they're just far more adept at what they do than even a solicitor who claims to have significant experience in estate law. But I would get involved as soon as possible. If you have access to bank accounts, check them and start making threats very, very quickly to the person on the other side and get that legal advice in place and let them know they're being watched. And I guess for yourself, if you're at the point where you're thinking about your end of life scenario, make sure that your will is in very good order and that your beneficiaries are protected in the way the will is structured, and that your powers of attorney are similarly structured so that misappropriation becomes very difficult to commit.
Is there anything else that you'd like to mention, Grace?
Not that I can think of, Catherine. Thank you for listening.
No, I think it's a very, very, very good cautionary tale for people out there, and some very sound advice or suggestions based on your own personal experience. So thank you so much for being with us today.
My absolute pleasure.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode of Don't Be Caught Dead, brought to you by Critical Info. If you liked the episode, learnt something new, or were touched by a story you heard, we'd love for you to let us know. Send us an email, even tell your friends. Subscribe so you don't miss out on new episodes. If you can spare a few moments, please rate and review us, as it helps other people to find the show. Are you dying to know more? Stay up to date with Don't Be Caught Dead by signing up to our newsletter and follow us on social media.
Head to don'tbecaught.dead.com for more information and loads of resources.